Hi everyone, Phoebe Rizzo here to talk at the Void again, and well, this one's one of my personal favorites of recent years, and it's definitely got some intensity to it. Now, the aptly named Sinister. Now, Sinister came out in 2012, about the time where almost every horror movie was naming themselves after an adjective, right up there with insidious or malevolent or what have you. And I actually didn't see this movie for some time and after it came out. And not for my lack of trying, I actually kept meaning to see it. When it was in theaters, well, I don't know how successful it was in theaters overall off the top of my head, but I was actually at the theater one night to see a very different movie. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark, if I recollect correctly, and noticed that, well, they had one showing left of Sinister later that night. But that was well after 11 p.m., and I was there around like 5 or so. So after my showing, I went home, thought maybe I'll come back later that night and see it, and promptly forgot. Cut to, I want to say 6 to 8 months later, where I was at a convention, a sci-fi convention in Minnesota, and they were spotlighting in one of their theaters Sinister. So, hey, maybe I'll get a chance to see it. But with the convention atmosphere and the movie starting after midnight, I was kind of wiped out by the time I got there, and the only other showing that they were doing was before I was going to be waking up. So, missed out on it again there. So, missed it once and twice, thrice technically, with the 2 chances I had at the convention, and then it exited my life once more. Until I finally just decided to, I keep hearing good things about it, and I moved on it. And I have no regrets on that. I'm just very glad I did see this one. This is an intense movie, a very intimidating film. And I would say the main cause of that would be the score. It's pretty much its own character in this movie with how oppressive the soundtrack really is, particularly during the films within the film, and it leads to a very unsettling atmosphere. But I think I'm getting ahead of myself. I should actually go into what the film is about. Well, this film takes place following Ethan Hawke, who he's playing essentially a washed-up crime novelist. He hit it big a long time ago with one of his novels to found something the police missed, so he keeps moving around the country trying to solve unsolved crimes. After that first one, he hasn't had any success. Now this time he's moving into the house where a very terrible crime happened. Then a family was hung in the backyard. Then it was a family of 5. 4 of them were hung simultaneously from a very big tree in the backyard, and the youngest daughter went missing. So he decides that is the house he wants to move into to research and see if he can figure out what happened to that missing girl. And almost right away, some strange things start happening, particularly when he finds in the attic a box of old 8mm films labeled home movies. And from there, away we go. He realizes quickly that the box shouldn't have been there, as some police photos showed the attic being empty, so he thinks they might have some interesting insights. Sits down and watches the most recent one, and, well, it's a recording of, first, the family that lived there, having fun and playing. And then it quickly shifts into the events of their death, and pretty much becoming a snuff film. Very freaked out, and considering there's a whole box more with years going back all the way to the 60s, he puts on another one and sees a very similar setup, but with an entirely different family in a different house. Of the same sort of general gist of just the family hanging out in one way, shape, or form, but then they'll do a cut and they'll be being executed in a terrible fashion. For example, yard work has them being run over by a lawnmower, or pool party has them being drowned. Family barbecue has them being burned alive. The family for this house was family hanging out. But just the atmosphere it conjures while these films are playing is uncomfortable. And the more he watches and the more he learns, the more he feels like something is watching him, and begins noticing some strange occult symbols in the films, as well as a figure that seems to be lurking just out of frame or just little glances. And at the same time, the more he watches, the stranger things start happening around his own place. His son starts sleepwalking and having night terrors. He keeps hearing things, swearing he sees things, and things keep getting worse. I will say it's best to go into this movie cold, so I won't go into any more about what happens, but it's a doozy of a movie. If you haven't seen Sinister, I do highly recommend it. I was reading some trivia on this one, and just for content alone, technically, between the amount of blood, language, and sex in the movie, which sex there really isn't any, and language not much there either, it's pretty much rated R just for content and intensity. So it could have almost gotten to PG-13, but with the quality of the snuff films, I don't think they could. So it's an amazingly acted film, particularly Ethan Hawke's, just his descent into terror as he's doing all he can to hold it together, half the heart being a desperate author trying to get one last score, one last bit of fame. So he does make some terrible decisions, but you can see why he's doing it, like why he doesn't just call the police. Well, the police department hates him, and as soon as he sees the first snuff film, he actually does dial the police. But you can see him looking at his first book like he's on to something. He knows he is, so he wants to be the one to crack this case open. I also say James Ransone does a great job as Deputy So-and-so. He's never actually named in the movie other than just the main character calling him Deputy So-and-so. So he adds a little bit of a comic relief that is kind of needed to help tension break, but at the same time, he does a good job being the dumb local, but having a lot of insight at the same time. So at first he seems like an idiot, but it's really just kind of a dorky awkwardness he has, and he grows on you throughout the movie. He does star primarily in the sequel, which is not nearly as potent of a film as this one. The sequel is only okay at best. I'll cover that one another day and the problems it has and the few things it does do interestingly, but for Sinister itself, the mythology that they do work into it is neat. And going to any of that is, however, hitting that spoiler territory, which is really best to see. This has got to be one of my favorite movies of the last 10 years, so, and it's one that I've, despite having taken so long to see it, have now watched it numerous times, and even knowing what's going to happen, it's a very taut movie. Very tense. There's, if it has one weakness, I suppose it's like some of the jump scares are unnecessary. There's one that I think was fine, but it's a Blumhouse film, so there's an ending stinger jump scare, because of course there is. And that one was really not necessary. If they had ended the film like 10 seconds before that, it would have been the perfect ending. So that's the only real complaint I have on this one. Otherwise, it's a very solid movie. There's some CG that's not the greatest, particularly with one of the paranormal entities, but it's used rather sparingly, so I don't view it as taking too much away, really. And like the makeup effects for some of the ghost-like entities are very good. There isn't a lot of really gore here to write home about, so there's nothing really to comment on in that in terms of effects, but otherwise, yeah. Usually they have more to talk about with a bad movie than a good one, so I don't know if there's anything else really to go into on Sinister. But I can't say it enough. Check this one out. For me, it's a solid 5 MacGuffins and has been since I first watched it. I can't recommend it enough. Take a look if you can. Thanks, everybody, and I'll see you in a couple days.